Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, SBC 205 public speaking classes. This is Vic McInnes, your helpful instructor, coming to you whatever time of the day you're consuming this piece of educational media with the lecture on, as you can see behind me, the audience and culture. So what we're going to talk about in this lecture is basically the audience, why they're important, and then we're going to talk about some of the aspects of culture that will impact our public speaking and our public communication. Okay, we're going to start with a quote from Thomas P. Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill was a member of the House of Representatives from 1953 to 1987. He is considered arguably one of the best speakers of the House of Representatives. He served as the Speaker of the House for 10 years from 1977 to 1987. He lasted longer. He lasted through 5 complete Congresses, which is a very unique thing for a Speaker of the House. Thomas P. Tip O'Neill said that in America, all politics are local. In America, all politics are local. And that's a key thing we need to remember. Now, usually that's brought up in political science classes. But I think it's important that we remember that the audience is why you're speaking. You're not, and you've seen these guys that are up there talking just to talk, just to make their point, just to hear their own voices. They don't care whether or not you're listening or not. They're just up there talking. Tip O'Neill reminds us when he says that all politics are local, that we need to focus on what's relevant to the people that are standing in front of us. Okay, the audience is key. It's why we're there. And I want you to remember that as we go through. Okay? So first thing we need to consider when talking about the audience is that we need to make our topic and our issues and whatever we're talking about relevant to the audience. We must demonstrate relevance. There's a couple of ways to do that. First of all, we can demonstrate timeliness, okay? And if we talk about this in terms of global climate change, let's be really, that's a controversial topic, but we'll use it as an example of the discussion. So when we're talking about demonstrate timeliness, we want to make sure that the audience knows that what you're talking to them about is relevant right now, okay? Not 15 years from now, not 20 years from now. In our culture, relevant is what's happening today. I think one of the reasons why it was so very easy for us to ignore global climate change is that early on in the arguments, before you guys were born, back in the 1980s, the conversation was always about we're going to have to make changes in the next 30 years. I think one of the reasons we're gaining traction, those conversations are gaining more traction now, is we're beginning to see more impacts. But a lot of people are saying we have to make changes today. So timeliness has got to be thought of. You want to show that you're relevant and your topic and discussions are relevant right now. It must be relevant to the particular audience you're in front of and not to a collective you people. It's got to be relevant to them now and what their timelines are. You must demonstrate proximity. And we've talked about this before. That, again, nobody really cared about global climate change until we started seeing impacts. Historic, year after year, historic impacts in California, flooding in Houston, hurricanes that were acting like they've never acted before, dumping 60 inches of rain on Houston, Texas in a matter of a couple of days. More hurricanes, more powerful hurricanes, more flooding, 100-year floods that are happening every couple of years here in the United States, okay? The ice shelf in Greenland and in Antarctica, nobody really seemed to be bothered by that all that much, okay? But when things start happening here, locally, and all politics are local, okay, people started to pay attention. And then you have to demonstrate personal impact, okay? And there's always an easy way to demonstrate personal impact. And as they say, it's the cha-ching, cha-ching. If you can show that your ideas are going to positively impact your audience's wallets, it's going to make them more money, it's going to save them more money, they're going to have to pay fewer taxes if they adopt your ideas, that's personal impact. Yes, there are others. There is, you'll be healthier if you do this. You're going to live longer if you do this. You're going to be happier if you do this. Your kids will be better educated if you do this. So those are all personal impacts that you have to demonstrate. Okay? So, let's discuss the first thing you need to figure out. You need to figure out the audience's initial disposition. The audience's initial disposition. Where the audience is when you start. Okay? Now, you need to know where they are when you start your speech and when you begin your communication, because if you want to get them to point C, you have to know how far along they are between A and B before you get started. Okay? First of all, you need to think about finding common ground. Find unity with the audience. Find out, once you start looking at that initial disposition, where they're at right now, find out some commonality that you share. Okay? Something that you can all agree on, and build on that. Use personal pronouns. Say we, not you, us, not them. Ask some rhetorical questions. Don't go overboard. Okay? But use that to, obvious answers like, we all want our kids to be better educated, don't we? We all want to live longer, don't we? We all believe that crime should be lowered in the United States, don't we? Okay? Those are questions you can use, but remember, with rhetorical questions, do not give the guy in the back row an opportunity to answer the question. Move on quickly and get it over with, okay? All right, so we need to do analysis to determine our initial disposition. There's a couple of ways to do it. First of all, demographic. And demographic is a statistical analysis of the people. It would be based on age, gender, religion, group membership, education, occupation, income levels. All that falls under the rubric of demographics. Statistical analysis or statistical information about your audience. Okay? There's psychographic. Psychographic is where you look a little bit, as it implies from the name, you're going to look into values, opinions, attitudes, and beliefs. Okay? You're going to look at their pre-existing ideas about your topic, pre-existing ideas about you. Okay? You're going to do situational analysis. Situational analysis is where you're looking at what you need to know about the actual situation you're going to be speaking in. The audience size, the occasion, how voluntary it is, physical setting where you're at. How is that going to impact your audience and your ideas? Okay? And then there is purpose-oriented. And this is one that a lot of people are going to focus on. Purpose-oriented analysis says that what is there about the audience that's important for you to accomplish your purpose? Not the purpose of the audience. The purpose-oriented is your purpose as a speaker. Okay? You're going to want to focus on listener motivations, emotions, and occasions, and the occasion as it pertains to you accomplishing your goal. Okay? All right, so those are our 4 methods of analysis to determine the initial disposition of our audience. Demographic, statistical analysis, psychographic, which is the values, opinions, attitudes, and beliefs of the audience. Situational analysis, which is deals with the situation of the event, the speaking event, and then purpose-oriented. And again, in purpose-oriented, the purpose we're not talking about is not the purpose of the audience, but your purpose in the speaking event. Okay? All right. So let's zoom along and determine where we will find this information. Okay? Sources of data for your audience analysis. First of all, mass media. And by mass media, yeah, I'm talking about the Aiken Standard, the Augusta Chronicle, okay? Yeah, they may have a circulation of less than 100,000, but they're mass media for this region. Okay, I'm talking about local news stations. I'm talking about websites. I'm talking about anything you can find from the area. So if you're flying, if we go back to our hospital where, we're trying to build a new wing to Aiken Regional Hospital, and I'm the guy that's going to come down from New York to look at financing, and I'm going to be talking to some people about getting their support for the hospital. I'm going to look at the local TV stations. I'm going to look at the local newspapers and the local radio stations to find out if they've been doing stories on the need for a hospital. Okay? You're going to look at the background of the organization you're speaking to. Chances are you guys are going to be speaking to an organized group. They're going to have a Facebook page, they're going to have a website, they're going to have a Twitter account. They're going to have something that's going to allow you to engage, okay? So you're going to look at the background of that organization, and another good way to do that is during the very first stages of the speech. When you get the invitation to speak, is just ask them. Tell me about the background of your organization, and they will always tell you. Members of an organization are always very proud of their organization, and they will be happy to talk to you about the background. Okay? You're going to have conversations with local people. Okay? Hey, you're having breakfast, and you're having your grand slam at Denny's, and you go, hey, listen, have you heard anything about the? Just casually ask the guy sitting at the bar next to you or at the booth next to you. Hey, listen, have you heard anything about the new addition they're planning on putting on Aiken Regional Hospital? And they'll hopefully say, well, yeah, and you can solicit information from them. Okay, and then there's interviews. Formal sit-down interviews where you call people up and you sit down with them and have a conversation. Okay? So ultimately, when you do all of this, your credibility, your success is going to depend on whether or not you're being credible. And that comes from demonstrating this knowledge and expertise, not only on the topic, but also the knowledge and expertise you have of the specific audience and the issues that they bring to the event. Okay? You're also going to need to establish trustworthiness. You're going to be able to need to show that you're telling the truth. And then you're also going to need to demonstrate, for lack of a better word, personableness. You're going to need to just remember how we talked about be animated, be personal, okay? Act like you care, okay? All of those things. These are all going to have an impact on how the audience engages with you. Okay, last thing. When does audience analysis begin and end? Audience analysis is an ongoing process. Okay, so it starts before you begin your speech. And if you just give your speech and go, I'm done with those guys, see you later, I never have to worry about that specific audience again, you're doing yourself and you're doing that audience a huge disservice. And here's why. You need to make sure that if you have to go back and talk to them, you understand what they got out of the last time. Okay? Or you're going to be presenting to an audience similar to them at some point in time in the future. So it behooves you to go back and after the speech is over, follow up. Call the person who invited you. Say, hey, be very honest with me. How do you think that speech went? What feedback did you get from the audience? If you're there afterwards, if there's a cocktail hour or if you're standing around afterwards, shaking hands and greeting people, it is a great idea to go, hey, how are you doing? I was the speaker, Vic McGinnis. What did you think of this speech? What did you think of the ideas? What do you think about the need for a new hospital? And people will, by and large, be polite, but they're also going to be, if it's something they care about, they're also going to be very frank. Okay, I think we see that more and more these days. We're coming out of a time when nobody would talk to you about things like that. They just go, oh, you were fine. Bless your heart for trying. Okay, I think now we're getting to a point where people will tell you, hey, listen, I liked what you said, but here's my questions. And if you know you're speaking to a similar group, again, and those questions are going to be incredibly important. Okay, that way you tailor and you can modify your presentation for the next audience. Or if you come back to this audience again and you have a chance to re-persuade, you can look at them and go, hey, listen, last time I was here, I know a couple of you had some questions about, and that's where you start your speech. You know, my first thing I'm going to want to talk about today is I want to resolve some questions I heard people might have had before, okay? So key point, audience analysis is an ongoing process. Audience analysis is an ongoing process. Now, audience analysis and the audience's attitude toward many of the things that we'll be talking about is in many ways shaped by the culture that we all exist in. Okay, so we want to have a quick look at culture and discuss what culture is. Okay, so let's talk about culture and communications for a few minutes. Let's hit some definitions first. Wikipedia, culture is a word for the way of life of groups of people, meaning the way they do things. Different groups may have different cultures. A culture is passed on to the next generation by learning, whereas genetics are passed on by heredity. Culture is seen in a people's writings, religion, music, clothes, cooking, and in what they do. Merriam-Webster. Culture is the custom, beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group, a set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution or a organization. Cambridge English Dictionary, the way of life of a particular people, especially as shown in their ordinary behavior and habits, their attitudes toward each other, and the moral and religious beliefs. Okay? So, let's talk about, so what we get out of that is culture is the way we conduct ourselves. It's the norms by which we shape our daily lives. We all exist in culture. You may say you're counterculture, but even by your being counterculture, you're defining yourself by the prevalent culture, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. So first, let's start off by talking about the 7 layers of culture. Okay, let me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 layers of culture. Okay, the first is national. Now, there's a lot of discussion going on. In fact, our national culture is so important to us that we're now in a war over it, because since the 1970s, we've been using this phrase called culture wars, and how we define our national culture is really sort of in flux right now. So a nation is defined as a body of people of common descent, history, language, or inhabiting a particular country or territory. Okay? So it's a group of people who sort of identify themselves as a body of people that have some sort of commonality. Now, our nation's commonality before 1960 was white, Protestant, suburban. You go back further back, it's rural. Since then, what's been shifting in our culture is that we're engaging and giving credibility to, and we're giving credence to other cultures, and people bringing their cultural artifacts with them. And by artifacts, I don't just mean statues. I'm talking about their behaviors and their cultural norms with them as they come to the United States. So the question is, do we have a national culture in the United States? Well, yeah, there's still some things that we all kind of agree on. We kind of all agree on the person who gets the most votes should win an election, even though sometimes that doesn't always happen here. We, as a whole, believe in sports and fair play in sports. We believe in certain dress codes that don't necessarily fly in other parts of the world. We don't believe that, in general, as our culture, that women should generally have to wear coverings to cover their entire face. But part of our culture up to this point has always been tolerance of people and their differences. We think that as a nation, we celebrate differences. The question is, does that still happen? And how we define that national culture. So the second layer is going to be regional. Oftentimes, the best way to identify your regional culture is leave that region. Okay, when I joined the Army in 1983, I went from growing, I've lived my entire life in the state of Alabama. I was born and raised in Homewood, Alabama. just south of Birmingham, a little town of about 36,000. I went to Auburn University. That time had about 19,000 students. The city of Auburn had about 12,000 people. And then the next thing you know, I wind up in Monterey, California for 15 months, which is just an hour away from San Francisco. So to see the difference, and then after I got out of the Army, I went and lived in Maryland for 10 years. So to see that mid-Atlantic and that West Coast culture is in contrast to the Southern culture I'd grown up in, it was radically different. Was it wrong? No, it wasn't wrong. Their culture wasn't. It was just as relevant, just as pertinent as mine was that I'd grown up in. I just wasn't used to seeing it. So, you know, in little ways, you know, thank you and ma'am and things like that. Now, in Maryland, people are much more brusque. They're much more to the point. They're much more, they don't talk to you if they don't have anything to say to you. In California, and it's the exact opposite. People will talk to you. People are very slow paced. People have got a lot of time, they think, to experience cultural things. So it's all very different. And I think for a lot of us, the regional layer of culture, which is associated with ethnic, linguistic, or religious differences that exist within a nation, we could probably identify 6 or 7 regional cultures fairly easily. You know, the New England, New York City, and they're not necessarily going to break down by state, but you get the Mid-Atlantic, the South. Texas would be a whole regional culture. The desert Southwest, the West Coast, the Rockies, things like that. Okay? Now, the next is going to be gender level culture. Okay? Now, gender level, and we're going to go into this a bit more detail. I'm just checking to make sure in my notes that we go into that. But gender is associated with differences between male and female. I'm not going to get a whole lot into that right now because we're going to discuss it in just a couple of minutes. Okay? Then there's the generational level. Okay? You can define the generational level now pretty much in 4 words. Millennial, snowflakes, and okay boomer. All right? We do radically differently. I have children who are both millennials. I respect their opinions and attitudes. I grant that to a great extent, there's a lot of reasons for millennials to be very frustrated with how boomers have been approaching the planet and how and about how we conduct ourselves. So there is that generational aspect of this. The only thing I would say to the millennials is be very careful about how you view us, because I remember how we viewed our parents. So one day that will shift. But a generational is associated with the difference between grandparents and parents and children and how we interact with each other. There's social class. And we like to think that in the United States there is no social class culture. We say we are a society without class differences, and that is absolutely not true. Where you go in life, how much money you will earn, what level your education will be, what the probability is that you will wind up in jail can all be dictated or all be predicted by the zip code you grew up in. Where you did your formative years from like 7 to 17. We have a class structure in the United States, and that's just a simple statement of fact. So socioeconomic class has an impact. Now, and clearly you can see that every day. If you see Bernie Sanders talking about the 1%, the 1% is doing the, okay. I mean, clearly that's socioeconomic culture, where social class, where, Bernie Sanders is leveraging resentment toward a specific cultural social class is part of his political campaigns. Okay? And then finally, and I want to very specifically define this for you before you jump to any conclusions. Corporate culture. Okay? Corporate. All right, now corporate culture is associated with any organization, not just a business, not just an incorporated entity that's there to make a profit, but any group that is formally organized will have a corporate culture. Okay, good example. And the biggest ones where we see these are churches. Okay, religious groups or formally, organized religious groups will have a corporate culture. So when I was a kid, well, this was after I was a kid. This was when I was in college. I came home for a weekend. I used to go to Oakmont United Methodist Church. The church no longer exists, but I grew up in that church. And my parents were a member of that church long after I'd left the house. So when I came home on weekends, I would go to church with my parents if they made me. By that time I thought I was too cool for church. So on one Sunday morning, my dad, there was something, I forget what it was, but I had been told I would be going to church. So I said, okay. So I'd been out a little late the night before to really bounce out of bed first thing the next morning. And my mother and dad went to Sunday school, and they said, hey, listen, my dad came in and said, you got to get up because you got to be at church in an hour and 15 minutes. So I got up, I showered, I grabbed something quick for breakfast. And then I ran into my room and threw on a pair of slacks and a pair of, and just a shirt. And then I went to church. Well, the head usher, just sort of grabbed me. He said, hey, great to have you back. Why don't you help me usher today? And I'm going like, sure, I'm good with that. Well, what I hadn't really thought about at that point was that I was wearing a Budweiser shirt. Okay. It had Budweiser, a couple of Budweiser logos on it. It was clearly a beer shirt. And in a small Methodist church in Homewood, Alabama in 1982, when the mothers of the church all sat in one row and stared at you. That was not part of the corporate culture. Nobody said anything to me, but apparently, somebody, more than a couple of them, cornered my mom after church and started asking why I was wearing, alcohol advertising in the Lord's house while collecting money. And so the corporate culture of Oakmont United Methodist Church was you don't wear attire or clothes that had beer logos on it. And that was made painfully clear to me as a result of that. So when we say corporate level culture, we're talking about any formally organized groups. Okay? So we as people develop our very identities from the predominant culture that we grow up in. As I said earlier, even if we reject the culture, even if we decide we're going to live our lives in a countercultural way, we're defining ourselves by we're not that. Okay? I reject the modern culture. I reject the prominent culture. I reject the overriding culture of our society. But you have to define what that is that you're rejecting first before you can identify what you are. We have multiple identities within our cultures, and each operates in a different environment. We have personal identities. Personal identities. And a personal identity is primarily intrapersonal. It's connected to our life experiences. It's who we think we are. Okay? It's all internal. It's intrapersonal. It's internal. It's who we think we are. Then we have social identities. And we could have, again, especially with social, we can have multiple social identities. It's derived from the social groups that we interpersonally are committed to. Now, I will tell you this. At times, I have been involved in multiple groups and had multiple social identities within each of those groups. Still to a certain extent. When I was growing up, my full name is Victor Lee McInnes. My grandfather's name was Victor Lee Mooneyham. My parents did not want me known as Little Vic, so they started calling me by my middle name, Lee. When I went to work, my very first boss looked at me and said, When I went to work in D.C., my very first boss said, "Do you go by Vic or Victor?" And I said, "Well, I go by Lee." And he said, "It says Victor L. McGinnis here. Do you go by Vic or Victor?" And I said, "Okay, I prefer Vic." And for the rest of my professional life, up to this very day, I am known at work as Vic or Victor. Outside of work, among friends and families, I'm known by my middle name, Lee. So there was this obvious dichotomy in those social identities. There was Vic or Victor at work and Lee at home. And it worked very well for me. In my job, it was considered a very bad thing, a felony to take work home. You couldn't discuss work outside of work. You couldn't take anything home from work. So to have those two separate social identities, indicated by the use of which name I used. Now, sometimes they would crash together, and I would have friends that I had met from work that became social friends afterwards, and you have to explain the whole detail of why the Christmas cards don't call me Vic. But that was a very clear separation in my social identities. Okay? Then there is cultural identities. A cultural identity is how you perceive that you exist within socially constructed categories that teach us how to behave. Okay? And you hear this all the time. Okay? You phrase it like, "Hey, man up." Okay? Act like our culture expects a male to act. Okay? Hey, South Carolina fans. Yeah, I'm a Clemson Tiger. Identifying yourself with a group like that, a bigger cultural group, dictates how you're supposed to act. I remember going to a rugby match in Edinburgh, Scotland, where a guy behind me yelled out some profanity. And the guy, one row behind him, said, "We don't do that." And the guy was just like, "Oh, sorry." These were two Scottish guys. One of them was just saying, "Hey, we don't use language like that at this stadium." Okay, and the guy said, "Oh, sorry, babe," and it was corrected. Okay? Oftentimes, identities can be assigned to us in two ways. They can be ascribed. That means given by others. Okay? Ascribed, they are given to us by others. Okay? Or they can be avowed. Spoken by us. Okay? An avowed cultural identity is where someone stands up and says, literally, "This is who I am culturally," and identifies with a particular group. Okay? We do that all the time in the United States. It's very common. I am a Jamaican American. I'm an African American. I'm an Egyptian American. That says my avowed identity, the identity that I speak, that I use to identify myself, is both American, but it also is tied to my Egyptian, English, Scottish, Chinese, whatever other culture you feel particularly tied to. Okay? An ascribed, we deal with this all the time. Ascribed, in fact, we oftentimes need to push back against this. Hey, girls don't act that way. Girls don't do that. All right? It's a phrase I try never to use when dealing with my daughters and raising them. But a lot of people believe in norming like that. So our identities are oftentimes given to us, but ultimately it's the ones that we avow that we speak for. Okay? Remember, these identities are not fixed and can shift over time. As we age, parts of our identities become more important or take on greater importance. Okay? Groups we have associated with in our social identities can change. So your social identities are always shifting. Cultures and expected behavior norms can shift and change, forcing us to conform or develop to a new corporate identity. Or, if we don't shape and conform to that new cultural identity, I thought I heard someone knocking on the door. If we don't shape or conform to that new cultural identity, then we can be ostracized by that cultural group. And again, I've lived long enough to see this, where certain phrases, certain words that were considered perfectly acceptable by some people back in the 60s and 70s or now would get you fired, literally. I've also lived long enough to see some words be accepted and embraced by cultures as a way of taking their power away from the people who would use those. And we've discussed some of those in class. Okay, now let's discuss some very specific cultural identities. And I'm going to tell you, some of you aren't going to like what I'm about to say, and I'm okay with that. In fact, I hope some of you aren't. Okay? So, first of all, let's discuss race. In our country, race is a powerful social, cultural identifier. But you need to remember, race is not genetic. Race is a cultural identifier, is a social construct. Okay? I used to keep handy a list of all the racial identifiers since the U.S. government started requiring you to, or offering you the opportunity. It's varied between requiring and asking you to identify your racial background. Okay? There's been 15 or 20 different listings. Sometimes Native American includes Pacific Islander. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, African American. At one point in time, the definition of that has changed. Okay? White is also, we'll discuss white in a second. Okay? Race almost always is hand in hand associated with power issues. Okay? That one race has power and uses that racial identity as a way to maintain power. Inclusion and group shift due to the requirements to maintain power. Okay. My ancestors, my family came over here in two groups. Okay. The first group came over was my father's family that came over from Scotland in the middle of the 18th century, in late 1740s, early 1750s. It was after the last Scottish War for Independence, the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745. The English government went out of their way to destroy clan culture. It was called the Highland Clearances. They drove, for the absent landlords, drove the Scottish farmers into debt and then dispossessed them. In order to pay their debt, they went into indentured servitude, where their passage to the colonies, in my case, North Carolina, in my family's case, North Carolina, they were shipped to the colonies, where they had to work for a period of anywhere from 7 to 30 years to work off that debt. My family at that point would have in no way been considered part of the main racial group. Being Scottish, the main racial groups that had political power at that time were English, German, and Dutch, and to a much lesser extent in certain parts, French, like up in New England. Scottish people were disenfranchised. They weren't. Now, again, I've said this before in class. I'm not comparing this to the enslaved people from Africa and what they went through. This is my personal experience. But as Scottish, we would not have been, if you use the term white as the politically powerful group within the United States, Scottish people were not considered to be part of that group in the mid 18th century. Okay. My mother's family came over here during the Irish potato famine of the 1840s. And when we got here, not only were we not accepted, the Irish not accepted as part of the political mainstream, there were laws in place preventing Irish people from getting certain jobs, from being allowed to vote in certain places. If you were an Irish immigrant, even if you became a U.S. citizen, you were expressly prohibited from voting in some places, from holding city jobs. Okay? We redefine being white based on the needs of the majority population. Irish became white in the Civil War when they needed hundreds of thousands of troops, and there was this big Irish manpower pool. And the Irish were very smart, and they said, yeah, we're going to enlist in your army, and we'll fight your war, but we got to get some payback. Okay, we have to get comeback on that. And when they needed them, they became white, for lack of a better word. The same thing went for Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans, Italians, Jews. All of them were outside of the main political power groups, and were not considered part of that main ethnic groups. Asians still, to a certain extent, feel that, okay? Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a great author, is talked about, everybody talks about the demographic bomb that when over time, white will become less and Caucasian will become less and less the mainstream. Ta-Nehisi Coates said, fine, they'll just, the political power structure will just redefine white and start including more and more people so that there is still a minority in this country that is reserved from power. Okay? Terms are often so broad in this discussion that it means nothing. There was a term for a while that has now been changed. They've been broken into two groups. But for 25 or 30 years, the U.S. government used the phrase Asian Pacific Islander. So that meant everybody from India all the way around to Hawaii were all considered part of the same ethnic group. And that included a third of the world's population. So that was just, it became meaningless to look at it that as a single cultural group. Okay? Some identities are very vague. Does Latin America include people from Spain or from whose family came from Spain? Do Hispanics from Chile, which is on the west coast of South America, have a great deal in common with people from Puerto Rico, which is in the Caribbean? In some cultures, racial identities and ethnic mix are important, even if it isn't legally recognized. In New Zealand, they are working very hard to embrace the indigenous people's culture, the Maori culture. And that is a great thing, and if we had the chance, I'll post the link so you can see Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, speak on that very issue. Okay? Now, you need to be aware that interracial communications can be very difficult and just a minefield, okay? Because the dominant culture within a nation will define what is correct and proper. It will try to force less dominant cultures to conform to those standards. In the United States, it's just a statement of fact that we all, the standard American accent is white Midwesterner. That's the way it's defined, okay? You need to be aware of that. Oftentimes, we do what's called code switching, where we shift our communication styles to meet cultural expectations. The problem is that when you shift culture, your communication style to meet cultural expectations, and you get caught at it, people will find you insincere, untrustworthy. The best example of that is Senator Al Gore. He was vice president under Bill Clinton. He initially ran for president, there was a Doonesbury did a cartoon of him. It was the first one was a card showed him Al Gore at Harvard. We must focus on moving forward with our mandate to economically develop and bring about a altruistic, and it just goes on and on. Al Gore in the well of the Senate. Today we must adhere to the standards of, and again, very high level English. Is it Al Gore campaigning in Tennessee? Hey, let me tell you all about my coon dog. Okay, and he got caught at it, and people, people disrespected him for it. Okay, so be careful of that. All right, next we want to talk about is gender. Again, I'm going to say gender is not biological. Okay, gender is based on identity. Sex is based on biology. We live in a patriarchy. Okay, we have to accept that this is a male-dominated society at this point. I'm not saying we have to accept it as it is always going to stay that way. It just is. According to the National Institute of Health, human, H-U-M-A-N, the word human is defined as male. Because research on human subjects almost always involves research on male subjects. Okay? Another beautiful example of this is in 2016, Elizabeth Warren went to her first campaign rally in support of Hillary Clinton, and they were both wearing blue pantsuits, light blue pantsuits. It was it was the lead story. It was mentioned. It was the front page of a lot of papers. Who wore it best? It was mentioned on a whole lot of newscasts that they were wearing the same thing. And then then somebody pointed out that at the last Republican debate that had 14 men on the stage, all men, no women, 14 men on the stage, every single one of them was wearing, you guessed it, blue suit, red tie. Okay? So our gender expectations are different. But remember that gender is a social construct. Male and female roles vary in different cultures. The roles are shifting here in the United States and our national culture, even as we speak. Transgender people are adding additional fluidity to the definition, and some people are opting out of all binary definitions and defining themselves as gender fluid. That is you may not like it, but that is a perfectly growing more and more valid as a way to identify your gender. We see now more and more, I see now more and more where it says explicitly on certain forms where you're asked to identify your gender, and it just says no gender, none. So or non-binary. Okay. Let's talk about. Okay. Sexuality defines who we marry, who we are allowed to be romantically involved with, who we can show affection to, and how we can show it, and where we can show it. While some attitudes towards some aspects of sexuality are generally beginning to shift, okay, there is still some tried and true thing. There are some things that just haven't changed yet. Just to let you guys know, the term heterosexual, to identify someone who is sexually attracted to someone of the other gender, working on the premise that there are only two. The term heterosexual wasn't coined until the late 19th century, when the British government was trying to strengthen their anti-homosexuality laws, and they had a word for when two people of the same gender are attracted to each other or engaged in a sexual relationship. They did not have one for what the other was, so they invented it. In 1970, up to 1974, homosexuality was considered a mental illness in the United States. That changed during the AIDS crisis. And remember, in 1984, okay, most of you don't remember, but in 1980, the mid-1980s to the 1990s, AIDS was considered a gay disease. Okay, and it was in many cases cited by people as God's punishment. We've grown past that, and I think the AIDS crisis was a catalyst for that. Where I have seen, even here in rural county of South Carolina, any number of my students have acknowledged to me that they were gay, and that's changing now. The reason we talk about all of this, okay, is because your audience lives in this, okay? They live in that culture. And you have to be aware of those cultural touchstones that your audience is going to have. So, am I telling you to change and not be true to yourself? But no, I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that these aspects of their culture have got to be respected if you want to be an effective public communicator. Also, intercultural communication. Let's be more specific, okay? Intercultural communication is, it can often be difficult because cultural identity is often ill-defined, self-imposed, and can constantly change. All cultures can suffer from ethnocentrism, where your culture is considered the best, okay? You may face challenges like ethnocentricity, but also social expectations and conflicting cultures. The definition of gender roles, social engagement cultures, communication rituals can oftentimes come in conflict. I spent a good deal of time in the Middle East where my female counterparts had difficulty engaging with the local culture because of their expectations of how females acted. It got to be a point where after a while it was just like, oh, well, they're American women, that's what they do. And our national identity got caught up in our gender identity issues as well. And that had to be dealt with by their culture. The global village has made it better, but some cultural touch points are hard to change. Okay, and we see that now, even though people don't necessarily think of themselves as white nationalists or white supremacists. You want to take down a Confederate statue in the South, in Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, it's going to cause conflict. And that's just the way things are going to be for a while. So, okay. That describes culture and audience analysis. Okay? And that will be our lecture for today. So we will see you around.